Hello, my name's David Bruce. Here's a 9 against 8 polyrhythm. The upper hand plays 9 notes for every 8 in the lower. It's the sort of thing you might hear in contemporary jazz or contemporary classical composition. So if I asked you to pick, was this from 1842, say by Chopin? Or was it from 1985 by, say, Ligety? You'd think it would be pretty obvious that it was a 20th century thing, but it's actually a polyrhythm found in Chopin's fourth Ballade. Chopin's music is actually chock full of polyrhythms, although this one is definitely one of the more complex. So it's not surprising that when Ligety wrote his piano Etudes some 150 years later, he was inspired by some of Chopin's ideas. But he also took the polyrhythm in a whole new direction. So I thought it'd be interesting to compare the two composers' approaches to polyrhythms. And I particularly want to think about the reasoning behind their approaches. Why were each of these composers interested in polyrhythms in the first place? Because as Adam Neely's bandmate Sean Crowder said in a recent really great video about playing polyrhythms, playing them is one thing, but finding a musical reason to use them is something else. What we'll find here is that in their approaches, Chopin and Ligety have some fundamentally similar goals behind their use of polyrhythms, but the way they achieve those goals are almost exact opposites. Now, the simplest polyrhythm to play and to hear is 3 against 2. Chopin did write some entire pieces where one hand plays 3 against the other's 2. This is the Etude No. 2 in A-flat major. In this next example, the right hand is more varied, but you can see that the left hand has a repeating triplet pattern, and whenever the faster notes are played in the right hand, they're grouped in 2 against the 3s below. Ligety himself described the effect achieved by these kinds of polyrhythms. The shimmering effect of simultaneously dividing the bar into 2 and 3 produces the metric tension, which in itself is one of the strongest attractions of the music of Chopin, Schumann, Brahms and Liszt. So this almost trance-like floating effect is one use Chopin finds for polyrhythms, and as we'll see, it's an approach that Ligety shared. Here's another example from Chopin's Etude No. 2 in A-flat major. This time the polyrhythm is 4 against 3. And here in a kind of 5 against 2 in the Nocturne Opus 15 No. 2. In fact, the 9/8 polyrhythm we heard at the start is another example of this kind of floating effect. But let's look at it again for a moment to see how this is achieved. The time signature is in 6/8, and you can see in the left hand we have 2 groups of 6 16th notes to fill the bar. Above that we have what today we would notate as a series of 16th note triplets, 3s running along against those 2s below. But the polyrhythm here goes beyond that. Look at the right hand again and you'll notice that every 4th note has a stem to produce this melody. Now every 4th note means that there are 9 equal notes fitting into these 2 bars, and if we take the top and the bottom of each arpeggio in the left hand, we get 8 below, making that incredible 9/8 polyrhythm. Chopin's music is also filled with shorter-lived polyrhythmic moments, which are also part of this aim of creating a hazy, free-flowing effect. The Nocturne Opus 9 No. 3 has a number of good examples. Here's a 5 against 3. Followed quickly by a 7 against 3. And followed a little later by what appears to be a 21 against 4. You'll notice though that the pianist there doesn't stick strictly to the beat. This kind of romantic piano music is full of what's known as rubato, where the beat is pushed and pulled to add extra expressivity to the music. And moments like this, which are sometimes known as fiorituras or flourishes, are really about expressing a free-flowing fantasy that overflows out of the meter, rather than a true polyrhythm. And this really is what most of Chopin's polyrhythmic effects are about. They are ways of creating a sense of freedom in the melodic line. They're certainly one of the charms of the music. But there is one other use which Chopin finds for the polyrhythm, which is to create a sort of manic energy, as you can see here with a fast 4/3 polyrhythm in the Fantaisie Impromptu. If the quarter note here is sometimes reaching around 168, even just the 16th notes are going by at quite a speed. But if you overlay triplets on top of that, the speed of the note impact is quite phenomenal. I calculated that at quarter note equals 168, with 7 notes being played in both hands every quarter, that works out at over 19 notes per second. And the implied multiple of 3 times 4 means the implied underlying speed is over 30 notes per second. So it's quite an incredible speed. Using polyrhythms to create a sense of manic energy is definitely something Ligety latched onto and took to a whole other level. Many of the examples we'll see here use polyrhythms at high speed to create a dizzying sense of vertigo and intensity. Unlike Chopin, it's sometimes used for comic effect, but often it looks at the intensity of something like the Fantaisie Impromptu and it says, "Hold my beer." But behind most of Ligety's polyrhythms there is a quite different technique at play. In Chopin's music you have a beat which is then divided into a series of smaller subdivisions. So one quarter note, for example, might divide up into 3 and 4 at the same time. So it's thinking about a larger unit and then subdividing it down. Whereas in Ligety's case, the approach is the other way round. It takes a very small unit, usually going by at a very fast-paced 16th note or 8th note, and it creates polyrhythms out of multiples of that initial pulse. So it's almost like he's looking for a similar effect, but coming from the opposite end of the process. So often in Ligety's music, the bar lines are merely there to help the performer divide up the page. The music itself is not constrained by the bar lines, and it flows over them in rhythmic patterns of varying proportions. Before we look at one of Ligety's examples, I want to show you one further example from even further back in music history, which influenced Ligety's way of thinking. Renaissance composers like Johannes Ockeghem and Josquin des Prez sometimes wrote what is known as a mensuration canon, which you could think of as a kind of composed polyrhythm in a way. Here's the original score from Josquin des Prez' Agnus Dei from the Missa Armé. You can see that there are 3 time signatures at the start, indicating that the same melody is to be played at normal speed, double speed, and triple speed, all one on top of the other. Here's what it would look like in modern notation, and here's what it would sound like. Ligety saw a way to use this kind of idea in combination with the fast pulse idea, so that multiple versions of a melody could play at different speeds. You can see at the start of his piano study number 6, Autumn à Varsovie, the regular fast pulse is played in octaves in a 4-note cycle. Over the top of that there is this descending chromatic melody, a sort of lamenting line, that here moves over every 5 of those 16th note pulses, so already forming a polyrhythm with the sense of 4 we got from the pulse below. Then later another version of the melody is added in, this time moving in 3s. In the most complex passage, you end up with several polyrhythms all one on top of the other in the ratio of 3, 4 to 5 to 7. So devilish manicness like this is definitely a strong feature of much of Ligety's music, but he's also interested in something quite similar to that shimmering effect he talked about finding in Chopin's music. Just as the polyrhythmic effect in Chopin can seem to transcend notes and create a free-floating effect, so Ligety, talking about the polyrhythms in his own piano concerto, noted how, after a certain time, it will lift off like an aircraft. The rhythmic events, too complex to be perceived in detail, hang in a suspended state. So however different the two composers actually sound, it's interesting to see that their goals are actually not that far apart. But I want to look at one further and rather different kind of rhythmic approach that Ligety used, which takes more of an influence from African music. Here, two rhythmic phrases of different lengths are placed on top of each other so that their cycles gradually shift out of sync. You can see that the right hand has an 18 eighth note cycle, while the left hand has 16 notes. So these two cycles repeat in their own hand and gradually move out of sync with each other. So rather than having 3 against 7, this has two different patterns which each have a different length, and they run on top of each other over this underlying pulse. The energy here is still quite manic, but you can see it's of a less demonic kind than the previous study, and this is one of those moments where the individual moments of the surface detail become less important than the overall musical object that gets created in space. Let's look finally at the opening of Ligety's piano concerto, the piece he talked about as lifting off, and it's a piece which comes full circle on that 2 against 3 idea. It's made up of two rhythmic cycles. The one that starts in the piano is in 12/8, but against it the orchestra is accenting a pattern that's in 4/4. So like the original Chopin example, at its heart this is a 2 against 3 polyrhythm, but here the added complexity on top of that is immense. I find it really interesting that in a way both composers are aiming for that lift-off moment, but the way they go about it is almost entirely opposite. Chopin's polyrhythms are music of heavenly drift, a floating, gentle lift-off, whereas Ligety's are a trance-like music invoked by a diabolic dance. I've often admired Chopin's polyrhythms before making this video, but I'd never really considered his motivations before. It's great that by comparing him to a contemporary composer I feel I can more easily relate to, I was able for the first time to understand that Chopin too was actively looking for specific compositional effects through his use of these techniques, whether it's that free-floating effect or the manic energy effect. Bringing ideas like this into focus is one reason I really enjoy making these videos, and I hope you find them useful too. And also like, comment, subscribe and share with your friends. So I did a 9 against 8 polyrhythm, but I realised that to do it properly these days you need to mimify it. Now unlike Adam Neely, who played his 7/11 polyrhythm outside of 7/11s, I thought I'd find something a bit closer to home to play ours. So to try and outdo Adam Neely, I thought you ought to practice your 9 against 8 polyrhythm by using 8 9 bars. Perfect.